Okay. Hi, everybody. Everyone hears? Yeah? Okay. I'm very honored to be here as part of this lecture series, and it's nice to see some of my listeners here. I see a bunch of names I recognize and some faces which I don't recognize because I don't normally see you. The Mishna we're going to learn today is a Mishna in the 6th parak of Pirkei Avot. Gdola Torah yoter min Kehuna umin hamalchut. Torah is greater than priesthood and than royalty. For royalty is acquired by 30 stages and the priesthood by 24, but the Torah by 48 things. Strange translation, things. But we're going to discuss today the difference between Torah, Kehuna, and Malchut. So Torah versus Kehuna, the priesthood, and the Malchut, the royalty, the kings. Stuart Cohen, who's a political professor of political studies in Bar Ilan, wrote a whole book about this called The Three Crowns, Structures of Communal Government in Early Rabbinic Jewry. And he says that this Mishnah is really all about the three competitors for leadership. Throughout time, there was always the different types of leaders, and everyone was always vying for the political edge. In fact, during the Hashmonaim time period, in the end of the temple, the Second Temple, sometimes the priests were also the rulers. The Hasmoneans, they were also priests and also kings. So sometimes there was an overlap. Some view this Mishnah as the rabbi's way of saying, we're the true leaders and we're the central authority. And it makes sense because after all, this is their book. And they want to say, well, this is our book, and here we're telling you that we are the true leaders. But I want to take a different perspective on this Mishnah. First, I want to consider a comparison of these three concepts: Malchut, Kehuna, and Torah. So if you take royalty and also priesthood, how does one become a priest? How does one become a king? Usually you're born into it. You don't get to just be a king unless you can actually revolt, create a revolution, but normally you're born into it. And the Torah is very different because the Torah is open to everybody. It's not a book that's only you're born into it. It's not at all. In fact, many people who aren't born into it can come into it much later in life. We'll get back to that later. Another distinction is that the priesthood and royalty are not intellectual jobs. You don't necessarily need to be an intellect to understand, and you can perform the job. We know lots of rulers who maybe are not necessarily the smartest people, but you can get to that job without having an intellectual activity to lead you to that job. It obviously helps, but you don't necessarily need it, and certainly not to be a priest. Again, the Cohen, we should call it. The Torah, on the other hand, is an intellectual pursuit. So we have so far dynastic versus open to anybody. We have intellectual versus not intellectual. Wealth and poverty don't necessarily play a role when it comes to Torah, whereas wealth often plays a role when it comes to kings. Many kings are wealthy, and it's hard to be a king if you're not. And in fact, the priests, you might say at first glance, if you look at the Kehuna, generally the Kohanim didn't have land, and they actually needed help. They couldn't afford to live without getting help from other people. That's why we have all the gifts that are given to the Kohanim. On the other hand, I don't know if this is a much less known fact, although if you learn the Daf Yomi, you'll find this out, which is that a Kohen Gadol actually has to bring what's called a minchat chavitim twice a day. It's a special meal offering that gets offered once in the morning and once in the evening. And he actually needs to be wealthy, it says in the Gemara, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to afford to bring this meal offering on a daily basis. And not only that, but if we look at the Second Temple period time again, we find that the high priesthood was actually purchased at the end of the Second Temple. It became a very corrupt leadership, and people bought their way into it. So also sometimes the priesthood has to do with wealth. Whereas learning doesn't necessarily have to do with wealth, although we'll also come back to this point later. I always think about those stories that my kids learn in school when they say it always has to do with the rich person was the bad person and the poor person was the guy who gave his life to learning Torah and didn't work. And, and he's always praised as the most amazing person. But again, those are the stories somehow our kids are told. I'm not sure why they choose those, but there's many stories in the Gemara of rabbis who were wealthy. There's rabbis who were poor. There's a wide range, and really it seems to have nothing to do with the ability to learn Torah. But again, we're going to see a story later which maybe has a little bit of a connection there. The last distinction I wanted to make, and feel free in the chat if you want to write some other ideas, if you have other ideas about what are differences between, on the one hand, priesthood and royalty versus the learning Torah or the Torah leaders. You can feel free to write something in the chat. Another distinction I thought of is that generally with the priesthood and the royalty, there's one clear leader. When it comes to Torah, Torah is something that's passed down from father to son in the olden days. Now, it could be father to daughter, it could be mother to son, it could be mother to daughter. It's passed down generally within the family. There's also rabbinic scholars, but throughout time, there's usually never been one scholar that's the head and that's the one everybody listens to. It's usually the biggest problem, that everybody thinks they're in charge and everyone should listen to them. But generally with the king, it's very clear who it is. The high priest, it's very clear. When it comes to Torah, that's not the case. What I want to look at now is, so the second part of the Mishna is interesting. The second part of the Mishna says, the reason why they're different is not the differences I said, and we have to see exactly why they're going to say Torah is greater. The reason why Torah is greater, they say, is because the royalty is acquired by 30 stages, priesthood by 24, and the Torah by 48. Now, it doesn't say right away what these things are, but we're going to look right now at the continuation of the Mishnah in source number 1. The Mishnah now says that these are the 48 ways in which Torah can be acquired. Okay, I'm not going to read all of them because it's a little bit long, but I'll read some of them. By study, attentive listening, proper speech, by an understanding heart, by an intelligent heart, by awe, by fear, by joy, by attending the sages, by critical give and take with friends, by fine argumentation with disciples, by clear thinking. I'm going to skip a whole bunch. One who does not let his heart become swelled on account of his learning, who does not delight in giving legal decisions, who you might have thought it would be the opposite, right? You want to give legal decisions, who shares in the bearing of a burden with his colleague. I'll skip a few more, who asks and answers, and who listens to others. If you look at these 48 attributes, again, I'm not reading all of them, but many of them, you can see this long list of something we would call midot, or positive attributes of a person. Now, if we look to see what are the issues about Malchut, how is Malchut acquired and how is priesthood acquired, you would expect the Mishnah now to go ahead and list the 30 things about Malchut and the 24 about priesthood. And if you look at the next Mishnah, which you don't have in front of you, and there's a reason why, it doesn't say anything. It only tells you the 48 ways that Torah is acquired. And it's very strange. Why doesn't it mention the rest of these? And it was troubling to me. I wanted to know what are they? There must be a list somewhere of these 24 and 30. So I did a search and I found that the Mishnah doesn't, first of all, I think the Mishnah doesn't mention it because it doesn't interest the Mishnah. The Mishnah's focus is all about Torah. It's clear that Torah wins out and that's the focus. But if you look in a masechet called Masechet Kala Rabati, okay, a little bit of a background on Masechet Kala Rabati. It's one of the masechtot ktanot, we call them, the small masechtot. A masechet is a tractate of the Mishnah. Masechet Kala Rabati is a small tractate, which is generally not attributed to the time of the Mishnah. It was attributed more to the time of the Gemara. And it's actually a more expanded version of something called Masechet Kala, which is kind of the shorter version, and this has more in it than that. And here, our Mishnah appears exactly as we saw it, that greater, okay, we can look at source number 2. Greater is learning Torah than the priesthood and royalty. For royalty is acquired by 30, etc. I'm not going to read that whole part because we already know that. And now it starts to list what are the things, how can one acquire royalty? And you're going to be a little bit surprised because you might have thought, based on what we saw about Torah, where it all described attributes, now we're going to have something totally different. Royalty is acquired by 30 refers to, and I didn't bring them all because it was a long list, but you get the gist. Silver, gold, wives, servants, maids, homes, vineyards, gardens, fields, orchards, officers, horses, chariots, swords, weapons, advisors, spies, judgment, chesed, righteousness. The last 3, at least, we finally get to something that has to do more with attributes. But all the others are items that a king, it's more what a king owns, and it's what a king is given. Right? If you become the king, you're given, you get a high salary, you're given everything you need, you're given armies, you're given officers, horses, chariots. It's all given to the king. If we compare that to the Torah, those were all things that one had to do. This is all one that people accept, basically. All of that's given to him. And the other thing is that he gets a lot of helpers, right? It's not something he has to do on his own, thankfully, in most of our cases, right? If we had our leaders running everything by themselves, I think we'd be in a bit of trouble. But they get a lot of helpers to help them. And they're not meant to know everything, really. If we move now to the priesthood, and priesthood is acquired by 24 stages. So what does this refer to? If we look back at source number 2, refers to sin offerings, guilt offerings, peace offerings, showbread, leftovers of meal offerings, truma, challah, first of the shearings, pidyon haben, firstborn animals, first fruits, the bikurim. Again, what do we have here? It's a little bit different because it's not all about the wealth, but it's about, this is what we call the 24 gifts. I didn't put them all in, but it's the 24 gifts that the priests receive. The priests, as I said before, they don't have their own property. They're not given land in the land of Israel. They have space to live in, but they're not given property. And they need the help of people to survive. So again, we have something that they're given, not something that they have to do. There's 0 attributes listed here, no expectation of that. It's all a list of what they get, regardless of their accomplishments, regardless of anything. This is what they receive. I actually struggled with this as a kid from a different perspective. I was born in a family of Kohanim, and I always struggled with the part about the bat Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen. Once she marries out, she kind of loses her rights to all of this. That was always a bit of a sore point with me when I was growing up with my 3 brothers, who clearly were going to continue as part of the Cohen family. And I always felt, okay, I'll be out of this. But in any case, right, it's obviously not so relevant nowadays, but conceptually, that line about the achoto habetula, who ends up, once she marries out, she's no longer. But what's really going on here is that you get it no matter what, as long as you're born into it, obviously, unless you're a woman and then you marry out. But both of these are by receiving, whereas Torah is acquired by actually doing and having to work at it, okay? And they're mostly actions or qualities that one has to either do, or maybe they're qualities that one has to develop while one is learning. It's not so simple when you're given the job to judge and then you're supposed to say, well, I don't really want to judge. You have to be humble about it. Or when you know a lot of things and then you have to have humility and not try to say, oh, I know everything. It's not so simple, and it's not so simple, but that's what they're talking about Torah here. Now, Torah is acquired. Let's go back to the first difference that we talked about. Torah is acquired not because you're born into it. This, I think, is the major theme going on here. There's many people that are born to Torah scholars and they grow up with Torah and they've been learning it since they were very little. But there's many people who come to Torah much later in life or at some point on their own. And the beauty of the Torah is that really it's open to everybody. Everybody can access it. Everyone can come in. Everyone can have an entry point at any point in their lives. We're told the story of Rabbi Akiva, who at the age of 40 decided to start learning. And it's not for the elite. It's not for the wealthy only. It's not for, like I said, those whose parents are Torah scholars. It can be acquired by hard work, but really by anybody. And in the words of the Mishna, right, by attentive listening, for example, by awe, by fear, by joy, by attending to the sages. There's so many ways. And maybe the idea about the 48 is that there's so many ways that one can get into this world. It's not a world that's barred to anybody. There's so many different entry points. For years, what's interesting about this is the Torah is really open to all, but for years it wasn't really open to women. And this is something that's changed over time, and it makes a lot of sense in a historical context. In those days, women, in the time of the Mishna, very few women were knowledgeable. They didn't learn. They mostly were in the house. And there were a few women always who excelled and who knew Torah, like Beruria and others. But generally, it was a door that was closed to women. So even though we say that the Torah was open to all, it wasn't always open to women. 8 years ago, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then we'll get back to it later. I started to teach a Daf Yomi class for women. When the last cycle started, I decided to teach a class. I looked online to see how people teach a Daf Yomi class because I didn't really know how one would teach a Daf Yomi class. I never learned Daf Yomi. I never taught it. I taught Gemara for many years, but always more in depth, never in such a quick pace. So I started to look around and I found that there were no women online that were teaching Gemara Shiurim. And I said, wow, this can't be. It's not possible. So I decided not only to give a physical class, but I decided to start recording it and creating a podcast so that women around the world could access Gemara also and hear it from the voice of a woman also for men to hear a voice of a woman, which is also very important, because I found all the teachers were all men, and men, it's obviously there's somewhat of a difference. Hard to say exactly what all the differences are, but there's obviously a difference in approach. I was lucky to be exposed to Gemara texts at a relatively young age. I didn't grow up in a house of Torah scholars. And in fact, in my house, Torah was valued, but we never really learned Torah. It wasn't something that went on in my house growing up. But I did I was brought up in a regular modern Orthodox household in America. And I went to a high school in Yeshiva Flatbush. And there I had a teacher who really instilled in me a love of learning. And because of that, I was able to progress within the learning I started at a young age. But many women have not had that opportunity and didn't study in high school or even post high school. And the doors were either closed to them, or I like to say they just weren't open up wide enough for them to feel like they were invited to come in. Okay, even if they weren't necessarily barred shut, like in Yentl, let's say, but people weren't as encouraging of women learning Gemara. And the idea of my teaching the class, and also of creating the organization Hadran to basically promote women's Talmud study and run the first international women's siyum hashas, was to change this perception. I wanted to make a change. In fact, the first year we did it, my family went on an extended vacation and I had to stop teaching the class. And the women in the class, I only had a few women that year. It started off a big group, and then, it kind of petered out a little, and people started to change jobs and they couldn't come anymore. And I had a few women, a handful of women coming. And my husband was ready for a sabbatical, so we went away for a few months. And I felt a little badly. I had just started this. Anyway, I went around, a few of the women in the group went around to ask in the local shuls about joining their classes and whether they could join the men's class. So the first one they went to said, "Oh, but there's a daf yomi for women's class. Why wouldn't you go to that one?" And I realized at that moment that even though I had a handful of women coming to my class, I had already made a difference. If the fact that the local shul, and this wasn't a shul I go to, they didn't know who I was, but they had already heard about the fact that there was a women's daf yomi shiur, that already makes a statement. And it already shows that things are going to start changing. Because when people start talking about it, and when I remember a woman showed up to class one morning and she came in a little exasperated. She said, "Yeah, my daughter was having a big crisis this morning, and we were talking about it, and I'm sorry I came late." And I said, no, it's fine. And then she said, "I really wasn't going to come at all, but my daughter," she was in the middle of this crisis, but my daughter, and she must have been about 16, her daughter said to her, "But you have to go to daf yomi, like don't miss it because of me," and I said, that is a success. It already shows that the girls are being brought up in an environment where they understand that their mothers value learning, and then that's going to filter down. So in the siyum hashas that took place in Yerushalayim in January, there were 3,300 people in attendance. Thankfully, it was before Corona hit. That would have been pretty bad. And the whole idea was really to raise awareness about women in Talmud study, and that this is something that people should be thinking about more and trying to affect change. Okay, I want to go back to this Gemara teacher that I had. So when I was in Flatbush, first of all, I loved it. We give these tests. We were learning Nezikin, which is all about damages. And the test would be, okay, Mookie the dog was walking down the street, and while he was walking, he knocked over a jug, and he this, and he broke some neighbor's this, and he brought it to life. And really because of him, I'll give him credit, Rabbi Raymond Harari, who's now the principal of Flatbush, he really made it come to life, and I was hooked. And I wanted, speaking about being hooked on learning, I wanted to bring up some stories that come up in Masechet Yoma, in Daf 35b. We're going to look at source number 3 now, who's going to tell, the Gemara there is going to mention some stories of other people who were hooked on learning. Remember I mentioned earlier that it doesn't really matter if you're rich or poor, and that learning Torah is really always accessible. So we're going to see from this story that it wasn't necessarily always the case. And this story, while it's the very famous story of Hillel, if you know the story about Hillel when he almost froze to death, we're going to see the story about him, and we're going to see that the rabbis had a very strong critique against the rabbis in the story. And the rabbis who put the story in the Gemara were criticizing the Beit Midrash. So here goes the story. They said about Hillel the Elder that each and every day he would work and earn a half dinar, half of which he would give to the guard of the study hall, and half of which he spent for his sustenance and the sustenance of the members of his family. So he was a hardworking person. Every day he worked. He didn't have any savings account. And every day, half his money went to pay to get into the Beit Midrash. So already we're going to see you have to pay to get in. You can't just get in unless you can pay. Although we'll see what happens if he can't afford it that day. And then half would support his family. One time he did not find employment. Okay, so one day he couldn't get a job. He couldn't get work, couldn't find work to do, to earn a wage. And the guard of the study hall did not allow him to enter. Okay, so here comes, you can imagine the big guard standing at the door. You cannot come in. Now, it's a good question. Did the people inside know that there was a guard outside? Did they know that he was blocking people from coming in? He ascended to, so what does Hillel do? Instead of going home, right, he didn't have work to do. He didn't go home. What did he do? He ascended to the roof, suspended himself, and sat at the edge of the skylight in order to hear the words of the Torah of the living God from the mouths of Shmaya and Avtalyon, the spiritual leaders of that generation. He so much wanted to learn Torah that he didn't care. He quickly, first of all, you see all the verbs. He runs into action, gets to the roof, suspends himself, sits at the edge of the skylight, just so he could hear the words. What does he want to hear? Pay careful attention. He wants to hear, in Hebrew, it's called Divrei Elohim Chayim. He wants to hear the words of Torah from the living God. Actually, the translation here is interesting. Divrei Elohim Chayim. I always viewed it as more the words, the live words of Torah that came from God, and that the Torah is alive. You could translate it either which way, obviously. And he wants to learn from these two great leaders. Well, let's see how great these leaders were. That day was Shabbat Eve. And meaning it was Friday afternoon. It was the winter season of Tevet. So that's pretty cold. And we'll see how cold it was. It was in fact snowing. And snow fell upon him from the sky. And he basically ends up there all night long. When it was dawn, here's the best line of the story. Shmaya says to Avtalyon, Avtalyon, my brother, every day the study hall is already bright from the sunlight streaming through the skylight. And today it is dark. Now here comes his funny line. Is it perhaps a cloudy day? Okay, now what's going on in this story? They have no clue what's going on outside. First of all, they obviously don't know it's snowing, it seems. They don't know, is it cloudy, right? Already when it's snowing, it's going to be cloudy. Anyway, they don't know what's happening outside. They probably, what's interesting is, what do they notice? They notice that it's usually bright and it's dark. First of all, stories always have dark and light and dark. Something's wrong today, right? When it is dark, it means something's wrong. It's almost a foreshadowing. But also, what don't they notice? Notice how the story started. Every day, Hillel the Elder, each and every day, he would show up at the Beit Midrash. Now, when he didn't show up the day before, nobody seemed to have noticed. Okay, how come they didn't notice that he wasn't there? I happen to have a daughter who notices. You walk into a room and you notice exactly who's not there. I'm not as good at it. I'm pretty bad. I usually notice who's there. I don't necessarily notice who's not there. But it's really a fault of the leaders that they didn't notice that Hillel hadn't shown up that day and gone out to look for him. And not only that, but when he sits there hanging in the skylight, they don't even notice him. All they notice is, well, you know, the Beit Midrash isn't looking so good today. It's a little bit dark in here. So what do? They focused their eyes and saw the image of a man in the skylight. They look up and they finally realize what's happened. So now they run into action. They ascended and found him covered with snow 3 cubits high. They extricated him from the snow and they washed him and smeared oil on him. And they sat him opposite the bonfire to warm him. Now remember, it was Shabbat. So they said, this man is worthy for us to desecrate the Shabbat for him. They say, wow, you're really someone. And we can desecrate the Shabbat for you. Now this is a very strange line because you're allowed to desecrate the Shabbat for anybody's life. And it seems, again, I think there's a bit of a critique here of these rabbis that all they think about is the elite, right? The people who are in the Beit Midrash, and here's someone who sacrificed his life, so he's worthy, but maybe it's almost saying that not everyone else is worthy. It's interesting, the translation here. The translation was taken from Sefaria, which is based on the Koran, and they add words. So these words are added. These are not in the Hebrew, but they're obviously relating to my issue. Here it says, saving a life overrides Shabbat in any case. However, this great man is especially deserving. Okay, but I don't think that that's the pshat here. I think they're almost saying there's people who are worthy and there's people who are less worthy. And then the story continues. I didn't give you the whole context of the story, but the context of the story is the Gemara basically says, if you try to make excuses and say, I couldn't learn because I was poor, well, you weren't any more poor than Hillel, and look at his story. And that's why it says, clearly poverty is no excuse for the failure to attempt to study Torah. Okay, so what do we have in this story? Let's try to figure out. Number one, we have that the rabbis were oblivious. We have this critique of the rabbis who aren't understanding what exactly is going on. There's a critique of this elitist position that it's just for the elite, that it's only for those who can pay, it's only for those who are worthy. There's an interesting contrast between what Hillel is seeking, the divrei Elohim chayim, right, the words of the living Torah, and he almost dies for them, right? It's almost, and he's worshiping, he thinks the Shema and Avtal Yom have everything, and really, and I think when they said, another way to read that line about them realizing that he's worthy, it's almost like he woke them up to their mistake, and he made them realize that they had it all wrong, right? When that thing, when an incident like that happens, it kind of shakes your world and makes you realize that maybe your whole perspective was really not correct. And the other thing I wanted to point out in the story before we move on to the next one is that there's this issue of consistency. Hillel every single day went to the Beit Midrash, rain, shine, snow, door blocked, no matter what, he was going to learn. Okay, let's look at the second story. Now we get to a wealthy man. Okay, you might say, well, I couldn't learn because I was poor. Well, you couldn't have been more poor than Hillel. Let's go for the second story. And if a wealthy man comes before the heavenly court, the members of the court say to him, why did you not engage in Torah? If he says I was wealthy and preoccupied with managing my possessions, right? Wealthy people, they have possessions to manage, they're busy, they don't always have time to learn. They say to him, were you any wealthier than Rabbi Elazar, who was exceedingly wealthy and nevertheless studied Torah? That's the intro. The Hillel story also had a similar intro, I just didn't bring it. They said about Rabbi Elazar bar Charson, here's his story, that his father left him an inheritance of 1,000 villages on land, and corresponding to them 1,000 ships at sea. He had a lot of money, and it was all inherited. Notice, interesting, we talked about the inheritance. And each and every day, again, we have each and every day, there was something he did every single day. What did he do? Each and every day, he takes a leather jug of flour on his shoulder and walks from city to city and from state to state to study Torah from the Torah scholars in each of these places. Here you have this very wealthy man, and what does he do? He takes a bag on his back, he takes his food with him, and he goes from city to city to learn Torah. One time, so very similar to the Hillel story, we had every day, and then one day something happened different. One time, as he passed through the villages in his estate, and his servants found him, did not recognize him, and thinking he was a resident of the town, they pressed him into service for the master of the estate. He said, right, they said to him, oh, you have to work, right? You're just a regular guy, we're putting you to work, right? It was obvious in his big office, they didn't have a big picture of the boss. Nobody knew him, nobody recognized him. He said to them, I beseech you, let me be, and I will go study Torah. Now, not only did he not recognize them, did they not recognize him, but he didn't recognize them. He didn't know his workers at all because all he did was learn Torah. He wasn't busy with his work. They said, so he said, please let me go study Torah. They said, we swear by the life of Rabbi Elazar bar Charson that we will not let you be. And they don't want to let him go. And they swear in the name of their master. At that point, obviously, he realizes these people work for me. And then he obviously says to him, listen, I'm Rabbi Elazar bar Charson, and I'm your boss. The Gemara comments on this, and in all his days, he never went and saw all his possessions and his property. Rather, he would sit and engage in the study of Torah all day and all night. So here you have the opposite perspective of someone who has all the money in the world and instead and has a lot of responsibility and all these workers working for him, but instead of dealing with it, he goes off and he goes to learn Torah. There's a bit of critique here. You would think that his workers would have the sensitivity to learning Torah that he did, and if someone begs them, please let me learn, and they don't actually. But again, it seems he really ignored all of his possessions and went off to learn Torah. If we compare this to the Hillel story, first of all, there's less sacrifice, but you could say it's the same kind of sacrifice. Here he leaves all of his wealth behind, and he does that just to learn Torah. So you could say also sacrifice. Another thing that comes up here is the way they learn Torah. And here I want to focus. They both learn Torah every single day, and they're very consistent about it. However, one goes to the same place every day, and the second guy goes from town to town every day learning from something different. I was thinking when you read a book and you like a book that you read, So some people say, oh, I'm going to read every single book that author has, right? And then you read them all and then you don't know where to go because you finished all the books that they wrote. But other people like to shop around and read all different authors and get all different perspectives. So here you have that, again, it goes back to number one, the Torah is open for everyone. Wealthy, poor, it doesn't make a difference. Number two, there's multiple ways to learn Torah. It's not that there's only one way to do it. And you don't always have to learn from the same people. You can, but you don't have to. And there's all different ways to go about it. Now you might ask, why is this so important, right? What's the issue here? First of all, the stories show, again, like we said, there's multiple ways to access. Anyone can enter. It's very different, though, than the priesthood and the royalty, which gets handed to you on a silver platter, so to speak. Whereas this comes with hard work, consistency, fighting sometimes against the odds, right? Each of them had to fight to get their way to learn Torah. I was also noticing that he doesn't use his wealth to get Torah either in the second story. You would think maybe he would use his wealth to be able to learn, and he doesn't. So again, you might ask, why is this so important, and why is Torah viewed as the most valuable thing? Because we didn't really get our answer from the 48 and the 30 and the 24. That didn't really answer the question as to why is Torah greater. What we really discussed was, how does one acquire Torah, but not why is it greater. So again, we talked about how does one acquire: regular study, commitment, conversation with others, learning in different ways. But why? Why did Hillel risk his life for it? Why did Rabbi Eliezer Baruch Harsom give up his wealth for it? And for this, I want to turn to the Gemara in Brachot on Daf 48, in source number 4. The Gemara was in the middle of a discussion here about Birkat HaMazon, which is the blessing after meals. And it said, it gave all the sources where we learn Birkat HaMazon from the Torah. It's explicit, it says it in the Torah. And then they say they all of a sudden segue into a very strange connection. The Gemara starts off, I'll read it just in English. I only have a Torah source for grace after meals, but from where is the obligation to recite the blessing of the Torah derived? This is a classic Gemara structure. It says, okay, we've resolved one issue, but now we're opening another one. So we understand Birkat HaMazon, but where do we get that you have to make a blessing on the Torah? Every morning in the beginning of davening, we say 3 blessings on the Torah. We'll get back to them in a little while. But the question is, where do we get the source that one has to make a blessing on learning Torah? So we're going to have 3 different answers. Rabbi Yishmael says, it is derived through an a fortiori inference from grace after meals. That's a way of saying a kal v'chomer, from grace after meals. Over food, which is an aspect of temporal life, one recites a blessing, all the more so, one recites a blessing over the Torah, which is eternal life. Okay, if you want to make the analogy, food is to the body as Torah is to the soul. Now, you could talk about eternal life, but I'd rather always understand eternal life in our world. And it basically means it's nourishment for the soul. The process of learning energizes. It gives you structure to the day. It's like exercising, right? People hear exercise on a daily basis sometimes, right? I assume a lot of you do. Exercise gives you energy to deal with your day, as food does, right? But often we say exercise is not just for weight, it's for your soul. Learning Gemara and learning any kind of Torah is also a food for the soul. And for me personally, it provides me with a sense of stability. Learning every day, I know that no matter what happens, I'm learning that day, right? It's part of my regular, in fact, now, I've heard this from many, many people, while we're all, some of us homebound without a regular schedule, without our kids in a regular schedule, having that structure of the daily learning keeps you grounded. The second option, the second opinion, is Rabbi Chia bar Nachmani, the student of Rabbi Yishmael. He says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, this a fortiori inference is not necessary. I don't agree with you. You don't need that. As this halacha can be derived from the same verse which grace after meals is derived. As it is stated, for the good land that he gave you. So the pasuk where we learn about Birkat HaMazon, about the grace after meals, is about Haaretz HaTovah Asher Natan Lach. We say it in our benching, right? That God gave us. He blessed us, and therefore we thank God for it. And below, with regard to the Torah, it says, and I will give you the stone tablets and the Torah and the mitzvah which I have written, that you may teach them. The same verb, I will give you, nitina, is also mentioned there. By the way, that's the same word we saw before, that the Kohanim get their gifts, and the priests get their gifts, and the royalty gets his gifts. This is interesting, because this is now talking about the Torah. The Torah was a gift from God. Here, just as giving with regard to the good lamb requires a blessing, giving with regard to the Torah requires a blessing. According to the second opinion, The Torah is a gift given from God. Now, if we talk about the difference between what we mentioned earlier about the priesthood and the royalty, those are gifts given by man. But this is a gift given from God. Now, if you think about a gift, everyone can try to think in their mind of a gift that they once received from someone. Okay, I received once a Megillat Esther from my parents. And every time I use that gift, right, if you think about the gift in your head, think about when you use that gift, I always think of my parents. Right? It connects you to the person who gave you the gift. So if you think about it, when you learn Torah, you're learning a gift that was given to you straight from God. So the act of Torah of learning actually brings you closer to God. So just like we said with the priests, if they get gifts, that's very different. This is a gift that's given straight from God and connects us to God. So the first is nourishment for the soul, energizing. The second is it's a gift from God. The third, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, proof for a blessing over the Torah from a different source is not necessary. Again, each rejects the previous. As it says, for good land, hatova, the land is good. Now they say, what is the good land? This is really for benching, but they say, because it says the good land, you can learn two things from it, not just good, but the good. So the first good they're going to learn that Tova is Torah. And they quote a verse where Torah is called good. And basically his answer is very simply, Torah is good. That's why you bless God. Sounds a little bit strange. What does it mean Torah is good? So you have to understand the use of the word good in the Torah. If you look at the first reference to the word good, where does it come up? Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, the tree of knowledge, was a tree that was given to distinguish between good and bad. And when we think about what did Adam HaRishon and Chava, what did they gain? They gain knowledge. Knowledge is very significant. Knowledge is good. So the Torah is good because it provides you with knowledge. What does this mean? Learning Gemara and Torah gives you a sense of where is everything, where does my tradition come from? It's very hard to appreciate our system of law and our tradition without understanding the background. So Torah gives you a deep understanding of all of these things, why we do what we do. I constantly receive comments from people who tell me, oh, I didn't know this was in the Gemara. We do this and I never knew why we do this. Sometimes normal things and sometimes very strange things. There was something in the Gemara the other day about, this is a very odd Gemara. Most Gemaras aren't like this, don't get the wrong idea. But it was about putting, if you choke on a bone, you should put something on you should put a piece of meat on your head and that will help you with the choking. And someone said, oh, my mother always used to say something like that and I never knew where she got it from. And that is a silly example, but it illustrates the point that there's so many things that we do that's part of our religion that we don't actually understand. And by getting an understanding, it gives us an appreciation. Now, if we look at the actual blessings on the Torah that we say in the morning, the three blessings. So much ink has been spilled on why there's three blessings. Normally, when we make a blessing on something, there's one blessing. You make a blessing and you're finished. You make a blessing on the lulav, you make a blessing on lighting Shabbos candles, and then you're done. But when it comes to the Torah, there's three blessings. So people say, why are there three blessings? And all different explanations. But after I learned this Gemara, I thought about a connection between these three concepts and the three blessings. And I think that each of the three blessings represents each of these aspects. So the first blessing is la'asok b'divrei Torah, which means to be involved in divrei Torah. So again, the constant involvement of divrei Torah, what does that do? It gives you a sense of grounding. It's not the learning of it. It's the essence of being involved in Torah. That itself grounds you and is strengthening. The second blessing is about, I'll paraphrase some of the words. It's to ask God to make the words of Torah pleasant in our mouths, and may we and our offspring and the offspring of our offspring, and it goes through the generations and all the house of Israel, may we be knowing of your name and studying your Torah for its sake. All about knowledge. It's to get to know God, to get to know about our religion. So that's the second blessing. And the third blessing is Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim. God chose us from all the other nations and gave us the Torah, the Nitinah, the gift. So the third relates to the aspect of the gift. Now for years, I've loved studying Gemara for basically these three reasons. These are it for me. It's the grounding, it's being involved in something important, right? I know that every morning I've woken up and I've already done something, something of value, something of importance. The second is connecting us with our tradition, understanding what we're doing. And the third is connecting me to God. So if I go back to Daf Yomi is really all about consistency. On the one hand, it's a little bit grueling because you have to keep up with it every day. But it's also, as I said, empowering, it's anchoring. It's kind of like the way people go to shul every day in a consistent manner, right? It sets the tone for the day. Actually, I want to get back to that idea in a minute. That wasn't what I meant to say right now, but what I wanted to say is it sets the tone for the day. Again, like I said, no matter what goes on, I know if I had a busy day and I had all sorts of things going on, I always have to carve out that time to learn. The other thing is that by learning Daf Yomi, you get to everything, almost everything. Much of our tradition is steeped in the Gemara. And you get to, whether it's philosophy, psychology, there's a lot of psychology, especially psychology of human behavior. There's philosophy, there's law, there's everything is in it. So it really gives you a basic understanding of all sorts of things, even if you don't understand all the nitty gritty and all the ins and outs. And the last thing is it connects me to God. This is where I wanted to compare it to tefillah. One of the other Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot says, the famous one, Al Shlosha Dvarim ha'olam omed, Al Torah, Al Avodah, Al Gmilut Chasadim, which is basically saying, right, there's chesed, there's prayer, Avodah is understood to be as prayer, and there's Torah. And these are three different ways of, I always understood that Mishnah, three different ways that one can get to God. So just like people go to Minyan, right, there's also learning. And this is a good way, or even not going to Minyan, but davening every day. It's a way of connecting to God. Torah is also a way that I find connects me to God. We go back to the siyum hashas. My goal was really to share this love of learning that I have and the students who've been studying with me, this love and passion about learning. I wanted to share it and take it out there and share it with others. And despite the fact that women from our generation are much different than the women in the time of the Gemara, and many women these days pursue intellectual pursuits, however, I noticed that a vast majority of Jewish women cannot hold their own in Jewish texts when it comes to Gemara. Most schools still do not offer serious Gemara curriculum. Certainly in Israel, the vast majority of girls' high schools do not have Gemara in their curriculum. It's changing. And things have been changing over the last 70 years, but I would say it's been changing in a very, very slow, gradual pace. And to this, one is I think women have been denied access over all. Once you're denied access, it becomes more intimidating. You learn a musical instrument, so the beginning you start learning and it doesn't sound like music at all, and you get very frustrated and it doesn't sound beautiful. But once you get over that initial hump, it's beautiful, right? Or going into the ocean, right? You have to get past the big waves to really enjoy the calm of the ocean. So it's like that with the Gemara. Sometimes you have to get over that initial fear and jump right into it to be able to get through it. And it's hard. People get intimidated by it. The second thing, which I think is a real misconception, is that people think Gemara is not relevant. They think the discussions are up in the air and they're all sorts of mumbo jumbo and they're talking about little details that are not so interesting and relevant. But it's true, there are some, I'd have to say. There are some that are not as relevant. But there's so many discussions in the Gemara that are so relevant. There's the rabbis, first of all, were very forward-thinking. They have a lot of places where they even protect women's rights in a way that I don't think other people in their times were. There's Pirkei Avot, where it discusses leadership all the time. If you've been going to the series, you know that it's discussing modern issues that come up all the time about corrupt leaders, etc. In Daf Yomi recently, we've been learning about how much intent plays a role for one being responsible for one's actions. Does it matter if you had intent or didn't have intent? That's a very interesting issue that comes up. So I think that's another reason. People think that it's not relevant, but really it's very relevant. And I think that the PR job that the rabbis did many, many years ago to make all these statements that women shouldn't be learning because it really wasn't relevant to most of the women in their times kind of stuck with people, and it's hard for people to get over that. So running a huge scale event, the goal was really to change that whole perception. And the goal was meant to make women realize, and not only women, we'll get to everybody also in a minute, which is that Gemara learning is both accessible and relevant. And there's endless resources nowadays. There's Cohen and Schottenstein, and there's podcasts and websites. And at Hadran, we built a site that has women's commentary on the Gemara now. And the goal is to bring accessible and relevant material to people. And one of the beautiful things I want to talk about Daf Yomi is this idea of the global conversation. Rabbi Meir Shapiro, when he started this in 1923, this was his quote about, he had two reasons for wanting to do it, and one of them was this. He says, what a great thing. A Jew travels by boat and takes Gemara Brachot under his arm. He travels for 15 days from Eretz Israel to America. You know, I usually think of this source and I say, now it's obviously a lot easier. Unfortunately, now it's a lot more difficult to travel from Eretz Israel to America. And every day he learns the daf. When he arrives in America, he enters a base medrash in New York and finds Jews learning the very same daf that he studied on that day. And he gladly joins them. And he basically continues to talk about this idea of this global learning. Now think about it, 1923, global learning, right? Nowadays, global learning is something totally different. I always wonder what he'd be thinking if he went on Facebook today and saw what's going on and the amount of discussions going on about daf yomi. And some people say he'd probably turn over in his grave and, the thought of women learning and all, and other people not religious. But I think he would actually be amazed because his goal was to create this global conversation, and the people should be talking about this, and people should all be speaking the same language. And really what's happening now is that people around the world are learning all the same thing. There was a Facebook post a little bit before the siyum. I was following all these Facebook posts about daf yomi learners, and there was a reporter who was looking for information about people who learn. And this was he did it in Hebrew, I'll translate into English. He said, I'm looking for the atypical Gemara learners. I'm looking for people who are not the men wearing kippas ruga, crocheted kippas, and sitting in the walls of the shul, the shul bench goers. So first people started writing about women. Then he said, okay, I see there's women learning, even though I kind of said, what do you mean? So you got 5 women learning, you think that women are learning the daf? And then he said, okay, what about non-Orthodox people? And he had a very hard time finding non-Orthodox people learning the daf. And what's amazing, what's happened, it's true that women have been learning the daf, and women have been, there have been groups of women, and there have been individuals, and Alana Krishan wrote a book a few years ago which encouraged a whole new wave of more women learning daf yomi and less Orthodox people learning daf yomi. But since the siyum, which again, it's not only the siyum, there were a number of factors that contributed to this, but the numbers have exploded, totally exploded. There's thousands of women who are now learning daf yomi or attending regular Gemara shirim or inspired to learn. I got an email from a woman who's a shlicha in South Africa. She said, I got there and I wanted to teach Gemara and nobody was interested. And now after the siyum, I have 3 beginners classes that I'm teaching, some to girls, some to women, all ages, and people are gung-ho about this. And what's really been amazing is I want to know if he put that post up right now, I think he would get thousands of people interested. There's Facebook groups that the first day they opened a Facebook group, after 3 days, there were 1,000 women in the group. It's unbelievable the amount of learning that's going on. And at Hadram, we've put together communities of women. We have 900 women who registered to be part of communities. They want to communicate with women that live somewhat nearby them, and they do their own Zooms and sessions where they discuss the daf and the learning. We created 50 siyums around the world for brachot, for women doing. Most of the women had never done a siyum in their lives. And it's really, really, really exploded. And I think that it was kind of this thing that was getting ready, all the, I would say, like I said, the last 70 years and even more so the last 20, 30 years, and the development of midrashot and all of that led to this event being able, the ground was fertile for it. And it allowed for, what I say is I think that there were really all these women who wanted to learn, and other people also, not just women, but men, who wanted to learn, but either didn't think they had access or didn't think it was for them, and it just kind of lowered the barrier, and then everybody just poured right in. And I think that that's, it's changed the whole map of people having knowledge. Once people have knowledge, it changes everything. So just to go through and summarize, I think we'll go through where we started. We compared Torah to royalty and priesthood. The main message we got out of it was that Torah is open to everyone. It's not something you have to be born into. It's not something you have to learn when you were young. It does help, but it doesn't mean that you can't get into that world at any point. It's acquired, yes, through hard work. You have to give some commitment to it, but it's well worth it. We talked about the 3 reasons. It's spiritually energizing. It provides a way to intellectually connect to our tradition, to better appreciate it, and a way to connect to God. I want to read you an email that I received from a woman after the siyum. A woman living in Manhattan, okay? I'll quote her in her own words. She says, I've always been passionate about all women's opportunities in Orthodoxy. So we're talking about an open-minded woman who's lived in an open-minded world all her life. She's she's around 50. She said, I've always said I'm not a Gemara person. I love Tanakh. I never love Gemara. Now, this is what I heard time and time again when I'd ask people, do you want to go to this hashas? And they'd say, oh, I don't learn Gemara. Gemara's not for me. I am obsessed now. Maybe I had to be older, whatever it is. And here she goes. Okay, I didn't make this up. This is exactly what she said. It's enhancing my day, inspiring me Jewishly, and deepening my appreciation for the intellectual side of Judaism. She says exactly those 3 things that we found here in the sources. I literally feel like I'm going back in time and listening to the conversations of a millennium ago, which I guess we are. Okay, and that's really what I leave you with, this idea of what Torah can do for you. And I want to just go back to that gift analogy. If we say that the Torah is a gift from God, and we think about gifts that we've received. So I mentioned this Megillah, which I use every year. I don't use it all year long, but I use it every year on Purim. And I always remember my parents when I do it. But sometimes you have gifts that you rarely use, and they sit there and you ignore them and you have nothing to do with them. And I feel like we're living in a time of history where many people are taking out that gift that they were given, and they're finding in it a real treasure. And I just want to say that we're really blessed to be living in the times that we're living in. And thank you.